So, good afternoon, everybody. I will continue on the lecture about international migration. And we stopped in the last class on these definitions of immigrant generations. So it's just good to understand those because these definitions are used a lot in the US to classify different generations of immigrants. And I have already mentioned some of them to you here. So the first generation is pretty much people who were born outside of the US and immigrated to the US. These are foreign-born people living in the country. 1.5th generation are also people who were born outside of the US and moved into the US, but the difference here that they arrived in the US when they were still children. So they arrived in the US when they were up to the age of 12. When people enter the US in such a young age, then of course they will be more exposed since they're kids to the American culture, to the American language. They're going to go to school in the US, in public school, private school, whatever, and they tend to integrate more into the American society compared to the first generation. That's why we make this distinction. And if we have really detailed information about the age in which these people entered the US, and we have enough amount of people from which we collected data, so we have enough sample size, we can break this 1.5th generation into those other three subgroups. The 1.25th generation are those arrived in the US between the ages of 13 and 18. 1.5th, those who arrived between 6 and 12, and then 1.75th, those who arrived up to the age of 5. So those that arrived up to the age of 5, they got here really, really young, so they might probably not even remember their home country. And like 1.75th generation, because they're going to be really close to the second generation. The 1.75th generation are those children who arrived here before reaching 5 years of age, but they were born outside. The second generation, they were born in the US, but their parents were born outside. But the experience of these children here who were born in the US and parents outside, compared to the experience of these children here, might be really similar compared to the situation of these guys to the first generation, right? In the second generation, as we did for the 1/5, we can also break it down even more if we have detailed information about where the parents were born. If we know that one parent was born in the US and the other one was not born in the US and the other one was, none of them were born in the US. None of them were born in the US. Both parents were born outside of the US. They migrated here, and then they had the children here. Those children will be classified as second generation, as the one that we have here. But if we have children who were born in the US and one parent was born in the US and the other one was born outside, those would be 2.5th generation. And the experience between the 2.5th be different than the experience those from the second generation. For example, I have told you already that my children were born in the US and I'm not born in the US. So they're second generation. But my wife is US born. So actually they are 2.5th generation immigrants. And what is interesting is exactly that, because in the household we speak mostly English. And of course, I still have my accent and everything, but that gives them on a daily basis much more contact to the American culture compared to someone who doesn't have any parents born in the US, the second generation. So that's why sometimes it's good to make this distinction between those children who are born in the US, and none of their parents were born here, and then one of the parents were born outside and the other one inside. And then the third generation are those that were born in the US, their two parents were born in the US, native born here is born in the US, like I said up here, and but their grandparents were born outside. But usually it starts to get really complicated because sometimes just one grandparent and the other three were born here, or two grandparents outside, two born here, or vice versa, 3 and 1. So we usually group all these people in the third generation and all these other variations that we might have as the third plus generation, right? So we usually term third plus generation are those that were born in the US, parents born in the US, and it doesn't matter where their grandparents were born. All that is really interesting because as a generation immigrant myself, when I look at a 1.5th generation, a second generation, and a third generation, from my point of view, how these people are experiencing the American society, integrating the American society, speaking English, experience all this specific culture that you guys have here, they are not different from each other, from my point of view. Of course, there are different race ethnicity groups, but in terms of language, in terms of knowing the culture and all that, they are pretty much integrated from the point of view of first-generation immigrants, right? But of course, some people who have been here for generations, not even the grandparents were born outside, everybody was born here in the US, you might notice differences. But overall, what we try to understand with all the subdivisions, it's what are the educational attainment indicators for all these different subgroups? What is the socioeconomic status? The percentage of this population that's poor? The percentage of this population that's unemployed? What are the crime rates for these people, right? And what we see overall, on average, the socioeconomic status of first generation is lower than third generation. But on the other hand, the crime rates of first generation are lower, so that's good, are lower than third generation. And the crime rates and socioeconomic status of second generation are closer to the ones of the third generation. We might say, when I come from outside, I might have on average lower socioeconomic status, but fewer chances of committing crime, but my children will experience intergenerational mobility, they will get better, socioeconomically speaking, but at the same time, they will start to leave the culture, they will same eating habits, start worse health outcomes because of the food in the country, and integrate in terms of the propensity of committing crimes. And then the second generation, on average, is more likely to committing crimes than the first generation. They're closer to the third generation. And I will show some data later in this presentation, and I'm talking about the US, right? So all the discourse that first generation bring crimes to the country, it's completely opposite when we analyze scientific data. But yeah, first generation tends to have, on average, lower socioeconomic status than the people who are already here, but they, on average, as we saw, there is self-selection in migration, they have better socioeconomic status than the ones left behind in their home country, okay? So it's just good to understand this, and I got this classification not from the textbook. I look in these different references here, and this report from 2014, it's a long report about integration of immigrants in the US, and specific chapters about socioeconomic integration, educational integration, culture, and everything. It's a really easy reading, and it was funded by the National Academies of Science. So it's a really high level of researchers who did this really long report, hundreds of pages. This short paper here from 2015 summarizes it. And you can find this long report and the short paper online, and answers to them are at the end of these slides. You can just Google and you can find it. So now, just going back a little bit to the lectures about theories of migration. What is the general knowledge that we have? Since we already talked a lot about this, I will go a little faster here. So Douglas Massey, the professor from Princeton, who is the most well-known demographer who studies international migration in the country. Immigration is a lot easier to start than to stop it. When people start migrating from one country to the other, because of war, because of violence, because of poverty, for whatever reason, once that those migration flows start, it's really hard for policymakers to implement a policy, build a wall, for example, that will stop people from coming in, right? Actions taken to restrict immigration often have the opposite effect, as I'm going to talk here about a recent paper that Douglas Massey published in 2019, I think, that he shows exactly the increase in border security at the end of the 80s. What it made was people who used to enter from Latin America to the US and go back, only male workers, once we start to increase border security, they come in with their whole family and stay. Because it's harder to come in. Once they come in, they stay. And they move to all different areas of the country. Don't stay only in the southern states. The fundamental causes of immigration may be outside the control of policymakers. The reasons why people migrate, their desires, why they want to move to another country, it's not well investigated by policymakers when they try to implement policies to restrict immigration, for example. Immigrants understand immigration much better than politicians and academics. Because they understand immigration better than policymakers, immigrants are often able to circumvent any policies aiming to stop them from moving in a specific country. I talked to you already before, again, in the lectures about theories of demography, in the specific case of international migration, and also internal migration, about the association between development and migration. There are these two different theoretical frameworks. The functionalist theory, that's more the neoclassical, the push and pull factors theory. Structuralist theory, also called the neo-Marxist or the center periphery. The functionalist theory assumes that socioeconomic forces tend toward an equilibrium. So if you have more poor countries and rich countries, people from poor countries will go to rich countries until the situation of employment opportunities, life standards, when everything stabilizes, migration will stop. The structuralist theory sees a general pattern of disruptions, dislocations, and migrations intrinsic to the capitalist society. The capitalist society exists in a way that there is inequality in all ways in our society that creates movements of people from one to the other. That can be within a country, as we saw with immigration, between countries, when we see movements between movements of moving from one country to the other. So the first one is pretty much saying, oh, it's a more automatic process. Once these people start to move to other areas, they will tend to stabilize in terms of opportunities, migration will stop. The structuralist says, no, the capitalist society is full of inequality. You will never have this equilibrium. People will keep moving from one area to the other. It's intrinsic to how our society is organized. So they see the migration flows in different ways. But both of them, although having these different explanations or views about migration, have similar assumptions. They do assess that countries that have higher levels of development will have less immigration. People will want to move out with lower chances from those places. And higher levels of development, higher development differences across areas leads to more migration. So more development leads to less immigration and, on the other hand, attracts more people, like the US, right? Of course, there are people getting out of the US, even being a more developed country, but it attracts more people than loses. In these different levels of developments across areas, this process of disruptions and differences across areas will make people move from one area to the other. In a graphical format, a way to summarize this association between development and migration, let's say countries with low levels of development, they actually have low levels of people immigrating out of those areas. Oh, but if that country is so poor, why people are not migrating out? Exactly because they don't have enough resources to move out to other places far away. As those places develop a little bit and become a little bit more developed, and people start to have knowledge about moving to other places, having the resources to travel abroad, the levels of immigration increase. But as these countries develop even more and start to provide good educational opportunities, health conditions, jobs to people, people tend to stay more, and then the chances of people emigrating, getting out of those areas will decline. And on the other hand, countries that have low levels of development tend to attract fewer immigrants. So the level of immigration is lower. As these countries develop more, you will start to see an increase in immigration, right? So overall, this is the association between development and immigration. And you have a specific time point that can vary from different countries to the other, in which the levels of immigration will tend to be higher than the levels of immigration. So in this case here, we have a negative net migration because we are losing more people than gaining. And here we have positive net migration, gaining people more than losing. And this is just an overview of where international migrants are living right now. Based on data from 2013, data from the textbook, more than 50% of the international migrants in the world are actually living in 10 countries, in just 10 countries. And this is the data here, like the US, Russia, Germany, Saudi Arabia, and so on. So, and this is data for 2000 and 2013. If you add all these the numbers in green from the green bars, it's of course more than 50% of international migrants are living in only these 10 countries. And the proportion of those living in the US, residing in the US, increased from, here we millions, it's not percentage. It increased from 35 million to 46 million, right? But then getting this information in percentage, considering everybody, these numbers in million, if we translate it to percentage, will be more than 50% of international migrants are living exactly in those 10 countries based on data from 2013. Here it's information about net migration, the major origins and destinations of international migrants. Those areas, they are gaining or losing more migrants based on data from 2010 and 2015. The US gaining 1 million more people in this period, more than losing. Russia, 220,000 people than people getting out of Russia. And then in these countries in the bottom, they are losing more people than gaining. So losing 720,000 more people than gaining per year, on average, throughout this period from 2010 and 2015. So that's data from 2010 to 2015, but getting the information for the average for each year. And of course, for Syria, you have such a great loss of people getting out of the country because of the Syrian civil war, okay? But then you see that you have different processes of immigration. And I showed you in the class about data sources of demography sources of data, that there is that map, the world migration map, that shows exactly those flows. Some countries receiving more people and some countries losing more people. And the link to that world migration map is in the course website. Here we have an information about of migration. We already talked about stock and flow of migration. The stock of migration is like right now. How many immigrants we have in this specific location? A lot of people moved into these countries in these last years and these last decades. Right now, after all this inflow and outflow of people, how many foreign-born people we have in that area? And we can represent that in percentage terms. And then we see that, for example, the US, Canada, West Europe, they have more than 10% of the population being foreign-born. The countries in yellow, with fewer than 1% of the population being foreign-born, based on data from 2013. Okay. And now going through a little bit more about the patterns of world immigration over time. And after that, I will go specific about immigration patterns in the US. And some of these topics here, again, I already covered, so that's why I'm going a little faster here. Before the humans began in sub-Saharan Africa about 195,000 years ago. By 35 years ago, humans were found at the opposite ends of Eurasia, from France to Southeast Asia, and even Australia. How modern humans went about colonizing all these different areas during these 160,000 years between these two time points here. Of course, the reasons why people moved out, it's up to speculation because we don't have data for that time, right? But overall, as these people start to maybe reproduce more and live a little bit longer, they start to need more resources to survive, and then they start to migrate to other places to get enough resources to survive. About 50 to 60,000 years ago, humans began to migrate out of Africa, first to Southern Asia, China, Java, and later to Europe. And then they began migrating to the Americas about 14,000 years ago. So Native Americans came to the US around 14,000 years ago. And then in the 1400s, 1500s, that's when the Europeans came. These movements were all through land areas and short sea routes. So it was like a really slow process of people migrating from one area to the other. Of course, probably here getting into the US and South America from the top, from Alaska, passing through Canada and going down, right? But it's a process, little by little, by land. There was like no transportation at that time and so on, right? After the first migrants, population flows to a new territory were usually preceded by an invasion of armies. So we start to see, we know all these different histories of wars between in ancient populations, and we can start to see expansion and then wars among these different groups. An example could be found in the raiding activities by the Scandinavian pirates in England, Ireland, and France between 800 and 1066 AD, right? So these are more recent years compared to the ones that we were talking before. And then now we start to see some encounters and more dispute for territory between populations, between different groups. And we also see forced migration. International migrations or invasions could also involve the enslavement and forced migration of the defeated population. So the conquerors of a specific population, when they won a war, they would get the people from the that lost the war, and you would use them as slaves into their societies. So for example, during the 5th century BC, Athens had about 75,000 to 150,000 slaves from both Africa and Asia. So you had already a lot of this forced migration going on from other countries to Europe. They represent about 25 to 35% of Athens' population. So that's a big proportion of the population, right? At least 1 out of 4 were slaves in Athens at that time, of people that were brought from these wars. After the 14th century, as I mentioned, international migration invasions became transoceanic. So Europeans started to go by boat to other continents. Territorial exploration led by large naval expeditions played a role in the dynamics of human migration to other parts of the unknown world. European migrants as a share of the world population, because of these naval expeditions, increased from 3% only in 1750 to 16% in 1930, saying that 16% of Europeans who are living in a country different than the ones that they were born in a country outside of Europe. The largest period of European overseas migration occurred between 1840 and 1930. 52 million people immigrated primarily to North America, right? Before World War II, intercontinental from Asia was smaller in scale. Asian Indians immigrated to British Guiana, East Africa, Fiji, Mauritius, and Trinidad. Japanese and Filipino migrants moved to Hawaii. Japanese migrated to Brazil. Chinese came to the US. Each one of these flows have several studies trying to understand them. So at the end of slavery in Brazil in 1888, the federal government tried to bring people from other countries to work in plantations, to work in the coffee plantations, for example, that they needed labor. The Japanese came a lot. There were a lot of federal policies from the government tried to bring those people. And also that's when we saw a lot of immigration to Brazil from Germany and Italy. The Chinese came to construct the railroads in West, and there's a lot of information about that. There's a lot of history about that. And both historians, or not only both, but historians, sociologists, demographers, there are different people investigating each one of these specific flows. Each one of them brings a lot of history. The largest intercontinental slaves migration in recorded human history happened between 1650 and the 1800s. Around 9.6 million enslaved Africans were brought to the American continent involuntarily. 11 to count those who died during the trips. So it's a lot of people who were forced to migrate from one country to the other. And these migration flows have a lot of consequences to the world. There is a geographic redistribution of the global population. It changes the race composition of populations, both in origin and destination. Pressures of the population on land and resources in the old world were relieved. In Europe, that you had a bigger population to the kind of resources that they could produce at that time, they start to lose people going to other places, so they have a little bit of a relief. Did you want to say something? I saw you. Okay. Birth and death rates were delayed in European countries with large immigration, while birth rates were high in the destination countries. International migrants, what happens is like when they move to another country, they want to build a new life. They want to have new opportunities. And usually their fertility levels are higher than the population that was already there in the destination area. In social, usually higher on average compared to the population left behind, because of this desire to populate, to conquer, to create a new life in the destination, right? The geographic distribution of races has also changed dramatically. By 1930, about 1/3 of all whites no longer lived in Europe, and more than 1/5 of all blacks no longer lived in Africa. So you had a lot of Europeans going to the American continent, going to other places, and Africans being forced to get out of the African continent. Since the 1930s, there have been several international migration movements, and more being forced migration. So refugees and asylum seekers, because of war, because of persecution, because of violence, because of poverty, people decide to move from one country to the other, seeking better conditions of lives in other places, right? So they seek refugee and asylum in other places. Large numbers of Jews and political refugees left Germany during World War II. 20 million Eastern and Central Europeans were uprooted from their homelands between Adolf Hitler's rise to power in the 30s and the end of World War II. World War II really changed a lot the dynamic in the world in terms of international migration, in terms of technological changes, all the efforts at that time that the countries put in to develop the army, machinery, guns, and all that, that actually created a lot of changes, technological changes in the world. And all these wars and deaths and persecutions made people migrate from specific countries to others. World War II ended, about 3 million Japanese were returned by decree to Japan from all the Asian nations, right, when they lost the war. And some other examples, these are just examples here that are in the textbook of migration in the 40s. After the partition of India in 47 into India and Pakistan, more than 7 million Muslims fled from India to Pakistan, and you saw also the opposite migration flow, around the same number of people, of Hindus moving from Pakistan to India. 1948, thousands of Palestinians were displaced from the territory that is now in Israel. This story is still going on there, right? The Gaza Strip, the West Bank, all these conflicts, all this generation after generation of Palestinians leaving in these territories without a real nation, right? And these are all histories that happened decades ago, and they're still going on and creating tensions. Pakistan and India, two nuclear countries, and Palestinians without a country to live and having all this tension with Israel, all that created all this international migration across countries for decades. In Southeast Asia, in the 70s, millions of Southeast Asians were uprooted owing to political and economic disruptions. This resulted in one of the largest and most tragic refugee migrations in history. 10 million refugees migrated from what has been East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, to India in 1971. And also, millions of Asians escaped from Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos into Thailand and elsewhere. During all these wars, these changes of regimes that were going on in the area, right? All these tensions between the capitalist and the communist societies. Afghanistan, that is on the news even today. Just now the war ended. I mean, we in the American pop culture, we hear about Afghanistan forever in Rambo 3. It's all about him going there and trying to save the Afghanistan population against the Russians. So the 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan generated massive numbers of refugees, people trying to get out of there. There were 6.5 million Afghan refugees between 88 and 91. Another 5 million refugees left Afghanistan from the early 1990s to 2000. And by the early 2000s, 1 in 4 Afghans were refugees. And then, after the US invaded Afghanistan, the same thing kept happening. People getting out, right? And creating all these international migration flows. The modern refugee era began at the end of the Cold War around 1991. Many developed countries were still engaged in violent conflicts after losing support from the Soviet Union, for example. Around 2001, there were 3.6 million Afghans found in Pakistan and Iran because of the previous Soviet invasion. 2003, several million refugees fled Iraq due to the invasion of the US. So the US messed up the life and the dynamic of several countries throughout the history. And in recent history, right, for Afghanistan and in Iraq. The United Nations High Commission for Refugees, UNHCR, really good source of data that you can get information about recent flows of refugees, asylum seekers. I always use their website to get information about the refugees, where the refugees from Syria are living nowadays. So they are a really good source of data to get information about refugees in the world. And they estimated around 46.3 million refugees in the world in 2014. Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, Sudan, and South Sudan sent out the largest numbers of refugees. Pakistan, Lebanon, Iran, Turkey, and Jordan are the countries receiving the largest numbers. Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, and northern Iraq are the ones receiving the largest numbers of Syrian refugees. Of course, Turkey receiving the most, then Lebanon and Jordan, and then northern Iraq. Cool. So a quick history, some examples of how international migration has been shaping, happening in the world, and now focusing on the US immigration levels and trends over time. Around 98.5% of US residents are either immigrants or descendants of immigrants. Right, so these are people who migrated here in these last few centuries. At least one of their grandparents was born outside. So these are all people who immigrated first from Europe, and then more recently from Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And in Africa before, of course. Europe, Africa, and more recently from Latin America and Asia. In 2010, about 1.5% did not self-identify as immigrants or descendants of immigrants. So whenever people answer the question about race ethnicity in the 2010 census, they reported some sort of being descendants of immigrants coming from other countries. American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians are the ones considered to be non-immigrants in the US. About only 1.5 of the population self-identify as one of these groups here. Most of the people, 98.5%, reported some self-identification with groups outside of the US. Immigrants of other countries are mostly migrant workers and rarely become citizens. Usually stories of other countries that receive large numbers of immigrants, but they don't have the opportunity to get permanent visas or to get citizenship in the countries of destination. So these migrant workers, sometimes it's usually used as people who migrate to a specific country, work there for a while, and go back to their country of origin. This term migrant workers can be used as migrants that move to another country temporarily. For example, in the United Emirates, 84% of the population is foreign-born. However, migrants have restricted rights and rarely become permanent immigrants. In the US, yeah, it's not easy to get a green card or become citizen when you arrive here as a first-generation immigrant, but the chances are higher than what we see in other countries. US receives most immigrants of all the countries in the world, around 46 million. And they're 14% of the US population is composed by immigrants, by foreign-born population. These 14% of foreign-born people living in the US is smaller than 84% of foreign living in the United Arab Emirates, in Qatar, and also in Saudi Arabia. So these other countries have a higher share of the population born outside of their territory, but these people don't have as many chances of becoming permanent residents as immigrants in the US. And here, just to give you an idea of the trends of immigrants in the US, the green columns are the overall numbers in millions in the vertical axis here on the left. So you see from 1850 to 2012, the overall number of immigrants entering the country declined a little bit in the 40s and 50s, related to World War II, but then it started to increase again. And then now you have around 40 million people in the US not being born in the US. But this data goes only up to 2012. But you can also see, in terms of in this information percentage terms, the red line and looking at the vertical axis on the right, the percentage of the population in the US that is foreign-born decline in the 40s, 50s, up to the 70s, and then start to increase again, and more stable lately. So around 13, 14%, like we mentioned here before, okay? This is pretty much the same information. The previous columns in the previous graph is this dark blue line here. The foreign-born population in the US in medians in the left vertical axis, and as a percentage of the total population in the light blue line as a percentage in the right vertical axis. The country of birth of immigrants in the US has changed since the mid-1800s. The origin locations of immigrants to the US have changed dramatically. In 1960, 75% of the US foreign-born, they were born in Europe. And now in more recent years, 2010, only 12% of the US population is composed by people born in Europe. And this graph kind of summarizes that. These are the overall number of immigrants in the US, and these are the numbers of those so that's between 1820 to 2009. And we see that the numbers are much higher for North and West Europe, and also for South and Eastern Europe in previous decades. So up to the 1930s, you had a lot of people coming from Europe in the US. And also the numbers from Asia were actually higher than the numbers from Latin America. And in more recent decades, what you see, the numbers of immigrants coming from Latin America started to increase and are now higher than immigrants coming from Europe. And the same thing, Asians, more people coming from Asia than from Europe. And the overall numbers of Africans coming to the US also increasing over time. So more Latin Americans and Asians coming to the US than from Europe. And the immigrants from Africa in the US also increasing a lot in these last decades, right? But the overall percentage of the foreign-born population is not so much higher than what it was before. Like before, it was even a little bit higher, around 15% back in the 1880s. And now it's around 13, 14%. So it's pretty much the same thing. It declined a little bit in the 40s up to the 80s, early 80s, but then increased, but it's not that different from what it was before. The difference are the origin of these people. They tend to be more from Europe before, and now they're more from Latin America and Asia. And here, another graph to show the foreign-born population region of birth. So the red area here, we see the share of these numbers in millions. In overall number of immigrants in the US born in Europe decline in absolute numbers in millions, and the overall number of immigrants in the US born in Latin America and the Caribbean increased over time between 1960 and 2010, and the same thing for Asia. But of course, the increase was much higher from Latin America and the Caribbean than from Asia, as we saw in the previous table. Here, the annual number of legal US immigrants by decade and region of origin. This is only documented immigration, so it doesn't include undocumented immigrants here, from 1960 to 2009. And then you have from Latin America, Asia, Europe, and Canada, and other areas. And the share of those coming from Latin America increasing over time. The share of those coming from Asia increasing over time, the gray areas. And the share of those coming from Europe and Canada, the light blue, kind of declining over time from 49% to 15%. And all the areas which includes Africa increasing from 1 to 10%. And from Latin America, it's interesting, increased from 39 to 51%, but then it declines now, more recent years, to 41, right? And increasing the share of Asians. So that's why in the textbook, the author, the poster, mentions that maybe what's he was suggesting based on this historical data is that usually these immigrants from Latin America, they have lower skills and socioeconomic status than the US born population. So they would tend to get the more low paying jobs in the US. Since they are coming now in fewer numbers a little bit in more recent years, actually the low skilled Asians could get those jobs, right? But because of the pandemic now, everything shuffled a little bit and it's becoming harder for everybody to get into the US. So it's going to be interesting to see how it's going to be in these next years and decades. This website, the Migration Policy Institute, you can just go there in this link in the bottom of the slide. And you can select whatever country that they have available there in that drop-down menu. Select the countries to see them here on this graph. And here is pretty much showing the immigrant population by country of birth. This is not the stock. This is the flow. This is not the, this is the stock, and it's how many immigrants are in the US in those specific years based on their country of birth from 1960 to 2017. For all these graphs that I will show here, I just got them in the Migration Policy Institute. For all of them that I'm going to show here, I'm going to always put Mexico in the graph. So just to keep the same scale on the vertical axis, up to 12 million. So it's easy to compare these graphs across the slides. And to see that although the overall number of Mexicans living in the US have been declining, still they are a really large population of immigrants compared to other groups. So now whenever you hear, before the pandemic even, all this caravan of immigrants coming to the US, it's pretty much with a focus on immigrants coming from Central American countries, from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. That's why I selected them here. Yes, there is an increase from these countries, exactly because of poverty, violence going on in those countries. And yeah, you see an increase. If you analyze them by themselves, it's a huge increase from really low levels to higher levels to almost, let's say, 1.5 million for each one of these countries. But still, overall, their numbers are smaller than people born in Mexico. The next slide, again, just keeping Mexico there, so the scale of the graphs here remain the same, because if I take out Mexico, this feature here changes the vertical axis scale. And here, choosing China and India as being the two countries from Asia that have been sending more international migrants to the US. And then you see, yeah, it has been increasing over time, like around a little less than 3 million from each one of these countries, but still much lower numbers than the ones from Mexico. But these trends here, it's what people have been trying to investigate. Which kind of jobs they will get? Are they going to replace the low-skilled Mexican immigrants, or are they going to get better jobs, being small businesses, entrepreneurs, and so on? The next one is just to show that migration from Germany and United Kingdom, and also put Canada in really, really low levels to the US, right? And the Germany population in the US actually declining over time. And here I did a study about, I recently published a paper that's available in my course website. And we started analyzing these flows of recent immigrants coming from West Africa, from countries that speak English. So we were focusing on Ghana, Liberia, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone, trying to see if these recent immigrants that have knowledge of English, if that would be better in terms of integration and influence increases of socioeconomic and educational attainment of their children. But since immigrants from these countries are really different, usually Sierra Leone immigrants have lower socioeconomic status compared to Nigeria, for example. At the end, in our paper, we focus more in Nigeria. They are really highly self-selected. The people who migrate from Nigeria to the US recently, they usually have higher levels of socioeconomic status and higher level of educational attainment. So what we saw in this study, controlled for a series of other variables, is the children of the Nigerian immigrants, so we call them Nigerian Americans, born in the US, parents born in Nigeria. So the Nigerian Americans, they have really high levels of educational attainment, even on average higher than the non-Hispanic white population. And in terms of earnings, similar levels of earnings as the white population. You would expect the earnings to be a little higher because their educational attainment is actually higher than the white population, but it still are kind of like similar in terms of earnings. So it's really interesting to understand that because each one of the subgroups have a different story. From these countries, these levels here, increasing, if you compare magnitude to Mexico, really small. But that's a highly selected group of people coming here already with good socioeconomic and educational attainment that creates better conditions for their children to integrate into the American society. This other graph, this is from the previous ones I collected from the Migration Policy Institute. This one here is from the course textbook. The foreign-born population by country of birth in 2010. Some Mexicans around 12 million in the US, China 2.2 million, and so on. And this 12 million represented around 30% of all foreign-born people. So 30% of all foreign-born people in the US in 2010 were from Mexico. 5% of all foreign-born people in the US in 2010 were from China, right? So Mexico is still a really high percentage, and we saw these numbers here. This around 11 million is exactly the same number that we are looking here, right? That's the number here. The stock of the population of immigrants in the US by country of birth. So immigration has a major effect on the size, distribution, and composition of the US population. We know that fertility and mortality in the US are really low levels, so we still have a lot of improvement to do. There is a lot of inequality in terms of mortality rates, but mortality rates declining. Now, because of the pandemic, we saw some increases because of the opioid crisis as well, but low levels of mortality compared to other countries, and also low levels of fertility. So the US has the highest fertility among developed countries, but lower levels of fertility compared to developing countries. So because of that, because we have low levels that have been a little bit stable over time, immigrants will have an important role in the growth of the population, right? Because immigrants usually tend to have higher fertility than US-born people, and that will not only with their direct effect of them coming to the country, but also the indirect effect that we talked some classes ago of their children in the US. So immigration contributed to around 30% of the total population increase between 1980 and 2000. The number of foreign-born US rose from 14 to 36 million between 1980 in 2005. And again, these are foreign-born people. Their direct contribution to the increase or the change in quality of the US population is big, but also as they have children here, that also contributes to a difference in composition of the population. Here we have an increase in the US born and foreign born population from 1980 to 2000. The total population in the US going from 227 million to 288. 213 million US born, 14 million foreign born, 253 US born, 36 million foreign born. So this 14 to 36 are exactly the numbers that I cited here in the previous slide. And the percentage increase of the overall population between 1980 and 1990, 10%. From 1990 to 2000, 13%. The US population increased from 213 to 229 million. That means almost 8% increase. And from 229 to 250, 9.3% increase. And foreign born from 14 to 20 means 40% increase. From 20 to 31 means 55% increase. Although we still have fewer foreign born than US born in the country, of course, these increases here were stronger consider each one of their groups within themselves. And this is the foreign born share of the increase. Overall, the foreign born population contributed to 30% of the increase of the US population between 1980 and 2000. And that's exactly what we wrote here. Immigrant contributed to around 30% of the total population increase. But still 70% of the increase was due to the US born population because the stock of US born in the country was 213 in 1980 compared to 14. The overall share of the increase of the population is still due to US born people. But this is an interesting number, 30% due to the foreign born increase from 14 million to 31 million. And this is the foreign born population by state in 2005. Countries darker, they have at least 15% of the population foreign born, and the ones with lighter colors, 0.9% or less, okay? So kind of showing that there's still a lot of variation of where foreign born population live in the US. As I'm gonna mention later, as we increase border security in the US at the end of the year, immigrants, instead of being the migrant in and back, now they come in and they just don't stay in the southern states, but they to all different areas in the US, okay? Here's the kind of like this stock of the foreign born population in 2005. Here is kind of like the increase, the percentage growth in the foreign born population between 2000 and 2005, to show that although in terms of percentage, these states here have fewer foreign born population than Texas, Florida, or New York State, for example, they have been experiencing a really high percent growth of foreign born population in 10 years, right? So the southern states have been experiencing a lot of increase, at least in percentage terms, of immigrants moving into their areas, into their states. This is also information about migration flow. Number of legal immigrants flowing to each state between 2003 and 2012. And in this case here, it's not in percent, as I showed before, but in absolute terms. 1 million more in California, New York State, and also in Florida. And most of the states in the country receiving less than 250,000 documented immigrants between 2003 and 2012. The migration stock, after all this history of people moving into the US, was the percentage of the population that is foreign born. This is similar to that other graph that I showed before. So this is a different textbook, a textbook by John Weeks. This data here from 2012 in percentage terms, it's kind of similar to this one here, right? From 2005, from this article. So this information from 2005, you kind of compare to 2012, you still see similar patterns. Southern state, Florida, in the north, in the US, having higher percentage of the population that's foreign born. And also based on this paper from Waters and Pino, this is that article that summarizes the long report funded by the National Academies of Science. No, sorry, this one is another one. This is not, it's a different paper, talking about projects of the US population. And what we already talked before, that majority-minority discussion. Census Bureau projections point to continued increases in foreign-born population in the next decades. By 2060, the foreign-born population will reach nearly 20% of the population. Non-Hispanic whites, by themselves, will be less than 50% of the population. That's what some demographers call the majority-minority society. And most of the immigrants nowadays, as we saw in the previous tables, are from Latin America and Asia. But again, this term majority-minority is controversial because we are putting together all non-white people in the same group, but the non-white people, they are really different from each other. I just told you this story about my paper about Nigerian Americans here, how their integration is really different, even comparing to recent immigrants from even Ghana, Liberia, Sierra Leone, who also speak English. Because of the high selective migration, the experience here is really different. So just talking about in these next decades, the US, we have less than 50% of the people being non-Hispanic white. That doesn't explain the diversity that the country has, because the other groups cannot just be put together by themselves. Because even some white people might classify themselves as being two races, are put in the minority, with African Americans, with Asians, with Latin Americans, and so on, right? An estimated 11 million people, about 25% of the Korean-born total, are undocumented. And annual deportations from this group have approached or exceeded 400,000. So 400,000 deportations per year of undocumented immigrants in the country. That's based on more recent data from 2016. Data for deportations and estimation of undocumented immigrants is always difficult, are always based on data from encounters with border security agents. So they're all based on estimations and how many encounters these border security agents are having. Encounters is actually them arresting the people in the southern border, for example. And, but this is usually the estimation of the number of undocumented people in the US, around 11 million people, or 25% of all foreign born living in the country. And here is just the population in the US by ethnicity, exactly showing that the percentage of non-Hispanic white is going to decline. Then by 2050, we expect this percentage here of non-Hispanic white dropping below 50%. And the percentage of Hispanics increasing, the percentage of Asians also increasing from 1 to 6%, for example, Hispanics going up to 30, and African Americans kind of staying stable, 11, 13, and 13% between these decades. Why is this playing music here? Is someone playing music? I don't have any music going on. About integration of immigrants. Many migrants from Mexico and Central America enter the US with low educational levels and little English proficiency, so usually they have low socioeconomic status. But as I mentioned to you before, these are the first generation immigrants. But the children of immigrants, the second generation, are seen to have converged substantially to the levels of education, earnings, occupation, poverty, residential segregation, or residential integration, and language as the US-born people. So although first-generation immigrants on average, and mostly those from Mexico and in Central America, have low levels of education and lower English proficiency, their children reach levels for a series of indicators in the same, they reach levels of their indicators to the same height as the US-born population. So they increase education, increase earnings, start to get better jobs, decrease poverty, increase residential integration. Of course, children of immigrants are raised in the US. They learn language, they learn English since they are children, since they are born, right? Integrated in the society, in school. But I mentioned to you before as well, even since the class about mortality, integration also produces declines in well-being. American fast food style of life declines health indicators. People start to integrate more into the society, and they involve themselves more in criminal activities. So crime is higher among children of immigrants, second generation, than among first generation. So that whole story of all Mexicans are sending criminals, it's exactly the opposite. Just look at data, right? If you want to hear empty political discourse, you do, but that's not reality, okay? The better ones are coming with better health, the Hispanic mortality paradox, that people with lower socioeconomic status and educational status coming from Mexico and Central America have better health outcomes. Their children, yeah, will get worse. American of life, right? They will be more likely to commit crimes, second generation compared to first generation. They'll be more likely to experience divorce and so on. Second generation, that's why I told before, as a first generation immigrant myself, for me, second and third generation, they are pretty similar. The way that they talk, the references of culture. One can be a little lighter or darker than the other, but that doesn't make any difference. Both of them are Americans. Both of them are integrated into the culture in the same way. Integration with native-borns, Hispanic. This process of integration of children of immigrants, the second generation, they tend to be closer in terms of all this, for better or for worse. They improve here and then decline here. They get closer and acquired, but there are different paces. This process of integration is fastest for Asian immigrants, slower for Latino immigrants, and the slowest for African American immigrants. And especially difficult for undocumented immigrants because undocumented immigrants don't have the opportunity to move around and to get improved jobs and engage in some better occupations because they don't have a valid visa in the US, for example, right? So, US born and recently arrived foreign born Americans by education. Overall, the recent arrivals, how do I close this here? In 2005, 32% of foreign born have less than high school, compared to 12% of US born. So yeah, the levels of education overall is lower of the ones that recently arrived in the US. But 33% have at least a college degree compared to 28% of Americans. So recent foreign born are more evenly distributed in these three education groups, right? But yeah, in terms of percentage of those with less than high school, higher among recent foreign born than US born. Language spoke at home of a US born population, around 46% speak Spanish, 16% only English, 7% Indo languages, 18% Asian or Pacific Island languages. So still a lot of variation among foreign born population in the US. So here I finished this part. It's already 2. So in the last class on Tuesday next week, I'm going to try to cover undocumented immigration, the proposed southern border wall, the economic effects of immigration. If we cover this, I'm happy. The simulation of US point system is important. And it is related to that thing that I just said now about the different educational attainment of foreign born people and US born. But if I don't cover it, at least this part is a really important, controversial topic. And I'm just focusing on the side that uses data science. Okay? Thank you very much. Have a great weekend. And don't forget to do the assignment that's due on December 10th for extra credit. Have a great weekend, and I see you guys on Tuesday. Thank you.